Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be discussing the media war against Israel, where so much of our mainstream media are showing bias towards Israel, particularly as Israel's fighting for a life against Hamas in Gaza. And we'll also be addressing the issue of the plight of Jewish students on campus with the rise of Jew hatred and the pro-Palestinian protests. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from Scotland. Her name is Christina Jones. She is the Communications Associate for CAMERAUK UK. Christina, warm welcome to the programme.
Thank you so much for having me today, Simon.
It's a pleasure. And Christina, you are a leading light in your generation, and well done for the pioneering work you've done in terms of Christian advocacy for Israel. And we'll be going through your very impressive CV later, but you've worked at the Israeli Embassy in the Public Affairs Department. You've worked as a representative for the Israeli Embassy up in Scotland, and now you're working for CAMERAUK in terms of doing student outreach as well as monitoring media bias from our mainstream media. So you've packed a lot into a few years. But share with us something about your Canadian heritage and how your parents came to Scotland.
Well, thank you firstly for that fantastic introduction. I probably wouldn't say all that kind words about myself, but it means a lot. Thank you. My Canadian heritage, well, my parents actually came to the UK. How old am I now? Okay, I have to do all of these, do the math in my head, but they've been in the UK for about 36 years. My grandfather's actually from Ealing, and my family, we have connections to Scotland as well. My grandmother is a first generation born in Canada, and my parents actually ended coming back here so my dad could actually fly planes effectively. And my parents have been here, they were meant to be here on a 3-year contract, and I guess God had humor for them, as you like to put it, and they've been here 36 years. So yes, and so that's why I have a funny accent for your viewers. That goes between Scottish and very Canadian at points as well.
Very cool. And I spoke to your dad on the phone. He's a lovely guy. And Christina, share with us as well how you came to faith in Yeshua, and when did the Lord give you a real love and a passion for Israel and the Jewish people?
So that's a twofold answer, I guess, for that one. So I was very young when I came to faith, actually. I grew up in a believing household, so I'm very thankful for that, and a very Zionist household. And I'll share a little bit about my history as well with that later. But really, 4 years old, very minor understanding of what God was and, salvation. And honestly, I think it was just the fear of not going to heaven with my parents. I think that's really what kind of like spearheaded me from Bible, from Sunday school, and so I accepted the Lord. Then I remember it, my parents were with me, I was in the car, we were passing Tesco. I can still see it today. So yes, some people may question that, whether I did understand that then, but I recommitted my life when I was 16, and when I came, that was in and around the time actually when I first fell in love with Israel. The first time I went to Israel during the, I always get the wars always kind of like all of it happening a bit confused, but during the second Intifada, so it kind of coordinated with all of that. But yeah, so I grew up in a Zionist household, as I said, but my family history, if you want to know a little bit about that,
of course,
is my great-grandfather was actually a personal friend of Lloyd George, pre-Balfour.
No way.
So as you can imagine, he must have had conversations about Israel and the Jewish people, and he also most likely would have known Chaim Weizmann due to the work that he did for, then it was called the Ministry of Munitions. He actually ran a munitions factory in the south of London in Southwark, if I'm getting my geography correct. So he must have known him as well there must have been some overlap too. Fast forward a little bit too, my grandfather actually was in Italy during the war for 4 years, and 2 memories I always have growing up as a child from my grandfather was first are you going to heaven, as any good grandfather or Christian grandparent would make sure. And the second one was always stand up for the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. And he was saying this from such a young age to me. 4 years old again, I remember this vividly. And I remember like as a little child going to my father, like, who are these Jews? What is Israel? You know, children don't see anything beyond their parents. They don't understand race, gender, sex, anything like that, or even religion to some extent. And so my dad was just like, don't worry, we'll teach you in time. Just listen to your grandfather. And then eventually my parents actually took me on our first pilgrimage to Israel when I was 15, 16. And it really made sense to me and how I got involved in this crazy world, as I like to call it.
It is a crazy world, but I'm so pleased you did as well. I mean, that's an incredible family heritage you got there as well, particularly knowing that Chaim Weizmann saved the British war effort during the First World War. Absolutely incredible story. So, and Lloyd George, of course, was the Prime Minister when the famous Balfour Declaration was signed as well as the San Remo Treaty. But share with us your experience. There's not many people I get the opportunity to interview that have actually studied in Tel Aviv, which is a nice university, very close to the main train link there as well. So share with us what it was like to study in Israel, to study in Tel Aviv, and what did you learn from your time, and what did you study more importantly?
So I studied archaeology and history, but specifically biblical archaeology, which makes sense in Israel. You know, you can't go to study history and archaeology without doing that. I actually did that for both my bachelor's and my master's as well. So when I was at Glasgow University, I did archaeology too. What was my time like there? It was very interesting actually, because by the time I finished my first year, I was there during the 2014 situation with Gaza then. So I was actually excavating about 25 kilometers or so from Gaza as well. So I got to see and experience the whole other side of Israel, that you know going into that situation that it could be a possibility that you're going to have to run to bomb shelters or everything. But did I fully understand it? I'm not entirely sure. I did like really make a stance then that I was going to be like firm and I wasn't going to leave when anything arose that was dangerous. So yes, it was fun to some extent, but also very informative and impactful as well. And I'm very thankful for my time there though. But overall, it was fantastic though. Other than that, you know, it was very fun to study in Israel and live there. And, you know, I learned to speak Hebrew as well. So I made sure I was like, if I'm going to live here, I'm going to have to make sure and to speak Hebrew and read it and write it. And I ended up actually being there for 3.5 years doing my master's. And actually my master's thesis is on Tel Azekah, which is mentioned throughout 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, if I get my Bible correct again, Tel Azekah. And just looking at the top from the Tel down and below is the valley of the Elah, where David and Goliath took place.
Amazing.
So I was looking out to that the whole time.
That's near Shiloh and that whole area of
exactly.
Samaria. Excellent. And Christina as well, and then from there you ended up working for the Public Affairs Department. So a born-again, Bible-believing Christian working in the Israeli Embassy in London. Pretty much unheard of. So share with us how the Lord opened that door for you, and what was your time like working for the Israeli Embassy, and we have to especially acknowledge Vivian Eisen, your boss then, the Public Affairs Director. So she's a good friend of mine and one of the most warmest, friendliest Israeli diplomats that I've ever met, and I loved interviewing her, and also her daughter as well, who served in the IDF as well at the time.
Well, thank you. Well, that's how we originally met, actually, was through the work that I was doing there at the embassy at the time. And I remember specifically sitting in this interview as well, listening to her and you interviewing her. And I thoroughly miss working with Phoebe. I will put that out there. She was fantastic to work with and always a great fun and laugh to have as well, but a very impactful woman as well, to learn a lot. And I have a lot to owe and thank her too. My time at the embassy, yes, actually, I believe I was the first one really in a public facing role within the embassy. Mostly people who were Christians were more like admin roles at the time. I was the one that was mostly, as you said, within the public diplomacy department, so really out there and known, and it came around quite quickly that there was actually a evangelical Christian working within the embassy, and I specifically was actually hired not by Vivi, but actually her predecessor, Elad Ratzon, who was wanting specifically an evangelical Christian at the time to really harness and work with the relationships and build the relationships between the community and the evangelical community, but also the other wider faith communities as well as what I dealt with. And my time there was fantastic. You know, I ended up then going to work for them in Scotland, as you mentioned briefly earlier, and basically running all their operations as well in Scotland and their engagement there too. But I just, would have I believed that I would have ended up there? No, but really was God actually leading me. When I came back from Israel after, you know, 3.5 years of living there, I was, you know, I'm more than happy to say this, I was fine with it. I was happy being supportive of Israel. I was never gonna, if anyone I knew faced anti-Semitism, I'd stand up for them. But really I was exhausted, I was tired, I didn't really want to be involved in this world. But everything in my personal life brought me back to Israel in some capacity. So I battled with God and what I was going to do as a career path for quite some time, because I studied archaeology for almost like 8 years by this point. You know, I was like, I'm going to do a job in heritage or archaeology or history or something. And as I said, everything brought me back. And eventually I was just like, after 6 months, I worked at the airport during this time, just to get some income to, you know, support myself and pay my rent to my parents. But then I finally just gave in. I was like, fine, I'll apply to the embassy. And with 3 days, I heard back from them, and they were like, "We've got this position. Would you be interested?" And I was like, "Well, I mean, I guess, like, yeah, let's go for it." And I've not looked back since. And really, like, you know, that term and phrase that people say is God has humor. Like, it really wasn't something I wanted to do, but I had to go through all of that as well to realize, like, this is actually what I want to do, and go through that learning process as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that your interest and passion in archaeology won't be wasted. So, and it's fascinating actually visiting the archaeological sites, because as part of the Christian Media Summit in 2019, so they took us to an archaeological site just on the outskirts of Jerusalem, where we're shifting through like coins belonging to the Second Temple era and stuff as well. And it really does feel like you've got literally history in your hands. So yeah, I can see the interest and the fascination in archaeology, but I think you're doing a much more important role now in defending Israel and building those key strategic relationships with the Israeli government and with the Jewish community. But share with us your current role. So you're currently with CAMERAUK. Explain to us who CAMERAUK are and your role within CAMERAUK and what they actually do.
Sure. So CAMERAUK stands for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. We were founded in 1982 following the First Lebanon War, where it was noted there was a need for someone to combat the misinformation within the media, because there was a lot of inaccurate information about Israel in the media at the time going around. So since then, we've been around then. We've now developed into several departments. So I'm here in the UK. There's an Israeli department, and the main office is actually in Boston. And we also undertake research and monitor media in Spanish, English, Hebrew, and Arabic. So we're covering quite a few bases there. And we've since developed into other departments. We have a Christian department, we have an education department, and we also have a campus department. In the UK, right now, what I'm working on is I actually have a very interesting role within CAMERAUK. I'm the only employee that they have that actually works within several departments, and hopefully things will be a bit more consolidated shortly. But I work for the research team in terms of monitoring Scottish media and helping ensure, you know, to report back what's happening in that and how we can combat the misinformation. I'm also overseeing the campus department that we have here in the UK, so working with our students. And I also work with the Christian department. So kind of similarly what I did at the embassy, engaging that with the various Christian communities and fighting, you know, this misinformation within the church about Israel as well.
Excellent. And Christina, show us what the political climate's like in Scotland in terms of Israel, because you know, I love Scotland. It's a beautiful country with beautiful people, and some real people that really love Israel in a powerful way, particularly all the Scottish regional groups that were formed after Israel's last major confrontation with Hamas in Gaza, as you say, back in 2014. So I had the opportunity to speak in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and one of my favourites up in the Highlands in Inverness. But also we know there's an incredible amount of hostility towards Israel as well. Share with us what it's like now in terms of Israel advocacy.
In terms of Israel advocacy, I'm not as involved in that as what I was once, but in terms of the political climate, we are seeing, I mean, it gets worse every day, in my opinion, in terms of what's coming out regarding Israel. But I know the former First Minister now, Hamza Yusuf, is very supportive of, the Gazan cause and everything. And I know in terms of, you really also have to understand the sectarianism in Scotland. You also have to understand the wider social background of Scotland to really understand how bad it is actually. And I would say Scotland in general, and has been for quite some time, the worst place for the Jewish community to be living, and also just any Zionist as well, because there is this rhetoric that you see within within wider society there is that, and this nationalist identity that they draw upon is they themselves see themselves as oppressed, like the Palestinian people. Also, they use that within the football, but so anyone who's more from it's a very complicated issue actually. So they see themselves oppressed, as I said, by the English. So they have that affinity with the Palestinian cause and not necessarily the Israelis. The Israelis are the English in this example. And then it feeds over into the soccer or football, for those who coin it here in the UK. It becomes a very sectarian issue.
You mean the Celtic Rangers?
Yes, Celtic and Rangers. So if you're Celtic, you tend to be Catholic, you tend to be separatists. You tend to support the Palestinian wider cause in that way. If you're Protestant, you're a unionist, you support the Israelis in that. So it's a very multifaceted issue. But in terms of being someone who's Jewish and a Zionist up there, I am worried for them because the community is small as is, and they have been leaving for some time, even before, the most recent with October 7th and how bad it's gotten. And now we're seeing wider issues within the UK in terms on campuses. And I mean, yesterday, I believe there was within the media, in the news, it was reported that 3 individuals were arrested for a plot against the Jewish community. Now that was a terrorist attack plot against the community here in London. But we're seeing how bad it's getting for the community, and it's only in time that it's going to affect them more and more in Scotland as well. And it's not a great situation there, in my opinion.
No, but it's great. You've got great people up there like Sammy Stein and Glasgow Friends of Israel and others that are doing a very good work in getting into the streets and conveying the truth of Israel and the righteousness of Israel's cause. I'm going back to your work with CAMERAUK. Can you just give an example of what is effectively kind of media bias against Israel?
So media bias is any form of misinformation about Israel. So it can be something and I say with the quotations, minor. I don't think anything is minor. But for example, just when I actually started the camera back in 2022, there was an example where we were discussing about how many times BBC Arabic actually said that Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel, for example. So we deal with minor things like that, and when I say minor, again, I reiterate, it's still a major issue, but this shows you the degree of issues that we deal with. And most recently as well, we've been seeing too, in terms of Rafah, we were fighting all that misinformation and saying and highlighting, within the wider reporting, this is all inaccurate, this is not appropriate, So it varies from day to day in what's actually happening within the media. Or we also have been highlighting anti-Semitism too. So when the Guardian posted that, anti-Semitic cartoon, and forgive me, I've forgotten his name, that was a couple months ago, we actually then republish some of the stuff that we've actually done on this individual who has a history of anti-Semitism as well, and feeding into this rhetoric of anti-Zionism as well. So it varies day to day in what we're dealing with, but anything that's misinformation against Israel or Zionism in general is what we deal with.
And Christina, share with us why it's so important to confront media bias, particularly when it comes to Israel, and why is it so dangerous that some, whether it's the kind of broadsheets or the tabloids or whether it's actually the TV broadcasters, when they report on Israel and they get their facts wrong, why is it so important to really acknowledge the fact and approach the journalists, approach the news producers, say, look, that report or that article was inaccurate? Why is it so dangerous that when it comes to reporting on the Middle East that journalists get their facts right?
Why is it important? Because I think the question is, why is Israel always held to a different standard than any other nation that we see consistently day to day? We don't see this kind of hatred or vilification of any other nation in the world. For example, when it came to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, we were seeing they were ensuring that the accurate information was there. Why is it we always have to, also with journalists, and when it comes to specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and more so now with the Israeli-Hamas conflict, why there's so much misinformation? Why are journalists being allowed to give their opinions? Why are they also accepting figures from Hamas, which are a known terrorist organization? And was it yesterday or the day before, the UN just came out and slashed the numbers of deaths without even giving a wider, not releasing it to the media. It's just now on their website from what I understand. So I think it's important that we need to do this, because no other nation, especially from a Christian perspective, we're told to stand with the nation of Israel and God's people. It's simple, that verse is, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee. And I firmly believe that as well. And we don't, as I said, we don't see it with anybody else. And I think we should be, holding journalists and media outlets to their journalistic standards. They're meant to come with no bias, but seemingly they do when it comes to this conflict, and are spreading lies consistently. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it does very well. So let's have a look at CAMERA in action. And this is their work to expose the work of France 24 regarding their coverage of Israel. So that shows us some of the impressive work being done by CAMERA to hold big multimedia corporations to account regarding their coverage of Israel and the Jewish people. Now, obviously, as a journalist, I have a different perspective when it comes to kind of media bias and accuracy of reporting, and knowing why journalists report in such a way, and you have a complete different contrast of views if you have a journalist writing for the Telegraph, for example, or the Times or the Mail, compared to a journalist who works for the Independent or the Guardian. They have to work within the ideological framework of the newspaper, but obviously the broadcasters, that's has the biggest influence over the public, because people will switch on, watch a bit of news, watch a very small news item on our mainstream media about the conflict, and then it's completely taken out of context. And of course, what's so powerful about broadcasting is the fact that if you read a newspaper, you look at the writing and your brain engages with the words, and then you process what's been written. If you listen to a radio report, you listen to what's being said, and then your brain processes it. But when you see a TV news report on Israel, your eyes tell your brain what your eyes see. So you don't process that information so much, and that's why it's all about emotional intelligence. You look at something, you end up instantly having an emotional response to what you're seeing. Of course, Israel is presented in so many cases in such a negative light that this is why Israel, in a sense, loses public opinion and support around the world. But share with us, as we have to discuss media bias, but we have to put it in the context of October the 7th and what's happened there. Share with us where you were, Christina, on that awful day, and how did you first become aware of the absolute horrors that were unfolding in southern Israel on that day?
I mean, I think I'm going to remember that day for quite some time. I actually was blissfully asleep, and then all of a sudden my dad runs in, banging up on my door, and I'm like, what's going on? And all he says to me is, Israel's been invaded. And I was just like, I'm like, oh goodness, okay, what? So I jump up out of my bed, and then I'm like, because that's all he said to me. And then so I run downstairs, and I'm like, okay, what's happening? Completely like in shock as well. I don't even know what time it was by this point. It must have been maybe 10 or 11, and just sheer horror, because it was coming out what was happening, like slowly coming out what was happening, and you're just like, but how bad is it? Is it also from the north? Is it going to be, is Jerusalem something going to happen in Jerusalem? All these thoughts. And then I'm like, oh my goodness, I have friends who live in and around this area, so I'm like messaging them like, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? So that, yeah, I'm not going to forget that. And then instantly was right on my laptop monitoring what was coming out, and to see like how I was actually monitoring the BBC at that point, because my colleague needed help with that, Hadar Sela, who's our co-editor for CAMERAUK, to monitor what they were saying, because we knew it was going to come back, and eventually there was going to be so much inaccurate information. And I think I sat on my laptop probably for like 12 hours straight from that point. And then for the few days after that as well, I was consistently working like 12-hour days, just monitoring what was coming out, because none of us could even, I think it was the only thing we could do to help and to really try and understand what was happening, even though we didn't know what was happening, and still didn't know if some of our friends were affected or not affected by the situation as well. So that's how it started, and what ended up for the next few days and weeks following as well.
Yeah, and how has CAMERA's work changed since October the 7th? Because obviously with October the 7th, Israel then became the focus of the international media, of journalists, of TV crews around the world reporting on what happened on October the 7th. And we've seen that focus shift from Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, with the Russia-Ukraine war, shift towards Israel. And this is where we are. So we see that Israel now is currently at the center of the international media circle, in which we see that Israel and the Jewish people are constantly in our news, and there's news stories either about Israel or about instances of anti-Semitism near enough every day now in our newspapers and in our news agenda.
Well, our work hasn't shifted in the sense. The shift is that we're overworked now. We don't have the capacity, unfortunately, and that's why we rely on, tips as well, because we are a small team and we will miss things, and that's the unfortunate reality. So I encourage any of your viewers, if they see anything that they think is inaccurate information, to be in touch with us. I believe later on you'll share the website that they can get in touch that way through my email address as well. It's on the website. That's how we do it as well. So we actively monitor ourselves, but we also encourage individuals to help us, because we also are human as well, and we will not see things. And it's not just the BBC, it's also The Guardian, The Independent, Sky News, anything and everything. For example, today I was just made aware of a tip that on BBC Radio 4, they had an individual who basically said Eurovision, the reason why Israel got so much was with the Zionist lobby, and he was allowed to say this on BBC Radio 4 Scotland. And that was a tip. So, we can only do so much. So we're not just doing, online print, but also if you see anything on the TV shows as well within, like, for example, with BBC, and send that through to us. And we will do our best to try and write a complaint, based upon that, once we assess it and see how we can work it within the wider issues that we're dealing with in complaints.
Because the problem that we face when it comes to kind of media coverage of Israel is that this war's not put in context. Mm-hmm. And it's not actually until you go to Israel and see the destruction caused by Hamas on October the 7th do you realise the magnitude of it. None of this was actually reported. When the news broke of what's happening in Israel, I had to watch I-24 because I didn't trust any other kind of media outlet when it came to what was going on in Israel. And then you see the magnitude of it, but also then you see also the destruction on what Hamas did as well was just beyond horrific. This is the biggest massacre against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. So you have to put everything in that context, but there isn't, that narrative has then shifted. Israel wins international opinion, and we see that Israel has favourable media reports after Israel's attack so horrifically, with the murder of 1,200 people and over 6,000 injured, and many of those critical, and then 250 hostages taken to Gaza. What Hamas did on October 7th posed an existential threat to Israel's existence, and Israel's deterrent capabilities were shot to bits. So you can understand the grief, you can understand the pain, but when you go to Israel, you realise that the war is secondary. What's more important is actually to get the hostages home, and sometimes our mainstream media don't actually convey the fact that Israel is a nation fighting for life. Israel is not in Europe. Israel is not in North America. Israel is in the Middle East. In the south, it has a genocidal terrorist organisation, Hamas, sponsored by the Iranians, that want to destroy her. The same with Hezbollah in the north. You have Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, again, want the destruction of the Jewish state, backed up by the Iranians and other extremists. It's not a friendly, safe neighborhood. And particularly when it comes to kind of reporting, it seems like our mainstream media want to focus on the narrative of focusing on the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, but never actually hold Hamas to account. Why is it so dangerous that our mainstream media don't hold Hamas to account for their atrocities and actually report within that context?
I think this is dangerous in general that they're not doing this, because the wider Western society deems them as terrorists. The UK government, Canada, I believe Australia as well, have deemed them as terrorists. And this fact that, you had media outlets not calling them terrorists, they called them, I believe, freedom fighters at the time.
BBC called them groups.
Oh, groups. See, everyone had something.
Like a pop band or a rock band, they call groups.
Debatable, it's for them, I guess, pick and choose. Words really form also public opinion and ideology and understanding when it comes to media coverage, but also understanding what is actually happening within a specific region. So if they're just hearing individuals, freedom fighters, they're going to go to what their most recent example is, understanding of that. That is too. So the fact that we've not been calling them what they are is, well, firstly, it's a shame because it's what happened. It was a terrorist attack on people. These were regular people who also were, from what I understand, a lot of them were very much involved in building relations between the Palestinian people and the Israelis as well. And they were brutalized and murdered, and we don't want to go into, I won't even describe anything further, but this ideology of trying to change and make them happy-go-luckies is beyond my own comprehension, and it does influence the way in which people will understand and go further with this conflict as well.
Yeah, because it's so emotionally driven.
Yeah, exactly. If you call them a group, as you said, a pop band, like that's a good, happy-go-lucky, feel-good thing that you understand. People know what terrorism is, and we associate that obviously with 9/11. So if we're not using that same rhetoric or words, we don't understand how the gravity and the situation. And again, people do not understand as well. Hamas are funded by Iran, who are connected with Lebanon, who are also connected with China and Russia and all of these other connections. So they're not understanding also the wider geopolitical impact this is happening and how this will also potentially influence the Western world as well. Come who knows when, but it's a lack of education as well too.
Yeah, well, I will say on air that Hamas is not only a genocidal terrorist organisation, it's also a death cult, and not only wants the destruction of Israel and the eradication of the Jewish people worldwide, but also wants to see the destruction of the West placed by an extreme Islamic caliphate, very much like ISIS, and it's important to call it out. But let's have a look now at this excellent news report. This is 10 years old, but this is a former Associated Press journalist speaking out about the bias within the Associated Press when it comes to Israel, particularly Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza.
During the summer of 2014, Israel and Hamas fought for 50 days. Reporters from all over the globe covered the fighting, often filling their stories with conflicting information and questionable reporting. After the war, former AP reporter Monty Friedman wrote an article called An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth.
And I decided at the end of the summer to write an essay looking at what has gone wrong through the lens of my own experiences.
For 7 years, Friedman reported for the Associated Press, a giant news organization that provides information to many other media outlets around the world. He says the AP and the mainstream press suffer from two malfunctions. One, Israel gets too much coverage, and two, the press has taken sides.
The mainstream press corps here has largely adopted an advocacy role. They've decided to play a political role in the conflict. They've decided to lobby for the side that they think is right, and political decisions are disguised as journalistic decisions.
Friedman says Hamas took advantage of the bias.
The strategy is to terrorize Israeli civilians using rockets, provoke an Israeli response, put civilians in Gaza in between the Israelis and the Hamas fighters by storing rockets in civilian basements, in the basements of mosques, in schools, and we've seen all those things documented this summer, and then having the huge international media contingent in Gaza film the civilian casualties, not the armed men, and use those pictures to spark outrage against Israel abroad, and that will prevent Israel from acting to the full extent of its strength against Hamas. That's the strategy. I think any intelligent person can see it, and yet it's not covered like that.
But the Associated Press refuted Friedman's claim. It issued a statement that said in part, his arguments have been filled with distortions, half-truths, and inaccuracies, both about the recent Gaza war and more distant events. His suggestion of AP bias against Israel is false. The AP denies Friedman's claim that the AP and other media ignored or underreported Hamas firing from mosques, schools, and UN facilities. But Friedman says the world is getting a skewed version of what actually is happening.
The story is, if you read between the lines and if you read the lines themselves, the story is that Israel is faced with a clear moral choice and is making the wrong choice. Israel could have peace, but it chooses war. That story is false.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
The excellent news report there put together by Chris Mitchell, but that is 10 years old, dating back to 2014, and you can see the current parallels with Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza now. Christina, you also do a lot of work with CAMERA in terms of on campus with universities. Share with us what's happening on campus when it comes to Israel. And of course, we've seen the news reports. We've seen it in the United States at Columbia University in New York, together now with Oxford and Cambridge, and now SOAS with these big protests against Israel. And of course, Jewish students are feeling increasingly unsafe. They felt unsafe prior to October the 7th, but now the kind of hatred against Israel and the Jewish people on campus has just escalated to a horrific level.
Well, I don't even know where to begin because it's just been nonstop since October 7th, especially within the campus world, not just even within the media world. But the students that I've been dealing with, I first want to say that I have such complete respect for them, because what they're facing is not something I could have stood up against back when I was a student, and I thought it was bad when I was a student, and I actually got cyberbullied a little bit for my beliefs and opinions of Israel, and it's nothing what these kids are facing on a day-to-day basis, and the resilience and their tenacity is something I completely admire. It is not a safe environment for Jewish or Zionist students on campus. I mean, if you put your head above the parapet, you're gonna be victimized in some capacity. We're now seeing, these encampments happening. We're seeing, the consistent weekly, there's usually a weekly kind of march around some campuses, calling for the resistance and Fatah genocide. The unfortunate reality is these individuals who are on, who claim to be pro-Palestinian, are not pro-Palestinian. They don't understand what they're actually saying. Firstly, it doesn't help the Palestinian cause. And they don't understand that it's actually, effectively doing what Hamas called for and did on October 7th towards the wider Israeli population. And I think they also don't recognize, that Israel, 20% of the Israeli population is Israeli Arab as well. So they're also calling for their death and destruction, But being Jewish on campus is some of the students I'm dealing with as well are terrified to wear a Magen David or the kippah, because they're getting not just anti-Semitic comments as well, their fear of, being violently hurt or harassed too. And that's unacceptable. And unfortunately, the universities are not doing enough, in my opinion. We just saw last week, Rishi Sunak meet with vice chancellors, I believe 20 from the top universities, to basically call them out on the anti-Semitism that's happening. I think the government were quite slow to do something about it. But it shouldn't have taken the government to step in either. The universities they have to look after their students, not just because of the Equality Act, but that they have a right to protect them. It's part of their self-interest as well. And they're not doing enough. And we're seeing, student unions coming out, wanting to do boycotts against Israel, signing motions. Student unions are separate from the universities themselves, but they are still connected and affiliated. And we're seeing some of the individuals within student unions calling for, what I just said, resistance, and not really understanding what resistance means. And we've already seen what resistance means from October 7th, according to, the pro-Hamas side. So it's not an environment, it's not conducive, and some of these kids are terrified that they may be reprimanded if they're not already being to some capacity, or they may have issues getting their degrees. They're fearful to say something in front of their peers, and even they're facing stuff from their own academics themselves. I've heard of academics basically denying October 7th happened, the rape of women October 7th didn't happen, saying, what happened to Israel is appropriate on October 7th. Things like this, that is firstly not a welcoming environment for any student, especially a minority who are already been historically persecuted, and more needs to be done. And do I have the answer to that? Unfortunately, I don't. Is it come too late now with the UK government to be stepping in finally? Yes, completely. We're now more than 6 months after October 7th. It should have been happening. Safeguards should have been put in place instantly to protect these students, because any historical conflict or rise with Israel and between Israel and Gaza, there's always been seen a rise of anti-Semitism and perpetuating, this idealism that, all Jews represent Israel, and that they have to be held to the accounts of the Israeli government. And so that's something, has happened historically. So why the universities don't have something in place as well, is also baffling to me.
Yeah. But isn't one of the major problems when it comes to Jew hatred on campus, and this is considering that our university students become the next generation of leaders in terms of business and politics and leading the nation, and they will take on those positions of leadership in the country, and we're seeing that our university campuses are so toxic, so anti-Israel, that what we're having is the international definition of anti-Semitism is not being implemented. So it's not backed up by law. Universities have signed up to it, but they don't actually apply it because there's no law to actually enforce it. And to know that if students don't feel safe on campus, then surely no one else is going to feel safe on campus either, because then it just becomes controlled and run by extremists who use the so-called Palestinian cause as a pretext for Islamicization, and that's what's so toxic. So show us how it's so important that universities understand the international definition of anti-Semitism and actually start implementing it, which is essentially calling, if you call Israel a racist state, that Israel has no right to exist, that Zionism is a poisonous, dangerous ideology, then that is just 100% pure Jew hatred.
I think it also comes to the fact that universities, there needs to be better education about explaining what anti-Semitism is within wider society generally. And I know there are organizations that do go around explaining what that is, but after they've done those training seminars, what are the universities actually doing to implement this as well to further protect students? In terms of IRA, you know, the government, I do think, are going to have to do something at some point, because for some reason, anti-Semitism is not treated the same as any form of other discrimination in the country, especially when it, within other minorities, we're not seeing this as well. More needs to be done, and again, it's hard. A lot of also universities have also adopted the Jerusalem Declaration as well, which again, if you really know what the Jerusalem Declaration is, it really undermines what IRA actually is. So a lot of them kind of went around to circumvent it that way, to say we've got this definition, Jerusalem's in the name, so we're not anti-Israel, we're not anti-Jewish, but that's a complete farce. It's a way to get around to protect those who, in my opinion, who are anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic as well. What were they going to do in the long term? Who knows? But they definitely need to be doing more to protect the Jewish students and Zionist students on campus. And I hope that does happen, but will it happen? I don't think it will, because we're too far gone now, and too many things have happened, and they've not done anything practical, in my opinion. Some have actually done some stuff. I mean, we saw in Harvard, I think university basically said, if you hire anyone who's part of these protests or something, at one point they were like, no, sorry, it was a law firm, I think, or something like that within the law department. If they found out they were from Harvard, they were no longer being employed. It's a very complicated situation. I'm probably getting it confused, but there were ramifications in that sense. But I do think, these students are being radicalized too. And what the long-term societal impact of that is as well is going to be interesting to see how that plays out and how it further fuels anti-Semitism in the years to come.
So let's have a look and see what happened recently in the States at Columbia University in New York. And now we're seeing this is happening on our own campuses across the UK, particularly at Oxford and Cambridge, and also SOAS University in London as well.
On Columbia's campus, Jewish students endured threats with calls to go back to Poland. Here, a demonstrator points at pro-Israel students while holding a sign that reads, "Al-Qassam's next targets." And a Jewish professor is denied entry to the campus while school officials look on.
I am a professor here. I have every right to be everywhere on campus. You cannot let people that support Hamas on campus and me, a professor, not go on campus. Let me in now.
Meanwhile, other Columbia faculty members join protesters chanting "Free Palestine" and calling for the school to divest from companies selling weapons to Israel. Demonstrations growing more radical have Jewish students fearing for their safety, leading one rabbi to tell students to stay away because the school can't protect them.
I was there today, and it made me sick hearing the things they were saying and doing. So over this holiday, I kind of just want to try to avoid it as best as I can for my own safety.
Monday, the school went to online classes only as New York Governor Kathy Hochul came to see the situation firsthand.
Students are scared. They're afraid to walk on campus. They don't deserve that. I've never seen a level of protest that is so person to person. It is so visceral. And I'm not calling on everyone. People need to find their humanity. Have the conversations. Talk to each other.
Protests, however, spread to other schools in the Northeast. Monday night at NYU, police clashed with protesters while making arrests as they tore down a tent encampment. At Yale, police arrested 45 students for trespassing as their peers celebrated them as heroes. Pro-Palestinian students at MIT have declared part of their campus a liberated zone. While at Harvard, officials shut down Harvard Yard until Friday to prevent similar protests.
The reaction is simply horror.
Rabbi Moishe Hauer told CBN News it needs to be stopped.
It's been happening in one place after the other at different degrees, and if it's not addressed properly and efficiently, it will continue to grow. If they're doing things which break the law, they should have consequences as defined by the law. But they must have consequences. The answer can't be, we spoke to them.
Monday, President Biden condemned the anti-Semitic protests while also condemning those he says don't understand what's going on with the Palestinians. Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
And our hearts must go out to those Jewish students on campus, both here and also in the United States, who fear for their own lives, they fear for their own safety, and shouldn't be studying in that hateful environment that we're seeing, because we're seeing that the Palestinian cause is being used to for Islamism and also for extremism, and we can't tolerate that. Share with us your role at on campus. So, share with us how you help to equip Jewish students, also Christian students who are interested in standing with Israel and the Jewish people, particularly this very difficult time that Israel's at war against Hamas in Gaza.
So we work with students in multiple ways. We actually have two main work streams that we work with students. So our first is through our fellowship, which is like more a robust way in which for individuals have a very well-founded understanding of the wider conflict, that they can partake in that. And it's over an academic year, and we have different tracks that they can do that help focus on their strengths. So we have a writing track, a general track, and an events track. And basically, depending on what track they do, we get our students to hold events on Israel education, but also combating the misinformation on campus. And we also help them, come up with ideas for topics and articles in which they are facing on campus at the time. We also work with, we also have a campus coalition, so it's working with Israel societies and supporting them and bolstering them up. So like helping them with funding in terms of events, funding, speakers, materials, whatever they need. But just generally since October 7th, my work has been crazy in terms of the different kind of support that I've been giving students, and basically helping them get legal advice or helping them, in terms of if they have faced anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism on campus, like how to go around that, and to get the university or relevant organizations who are working on the complaint to help bolster it up. But we also work further with, we also have our own campaigns actually to help students combat this misinformation that they're facing on campus. So we have one that's called Mizrahi Week, which is usually in November each year, about explaining what the plight of Mizrahi Jews and explaining their expulsion from Arab lands. There's a lot of misinformation about that. People only think it's Palestinian refugees. We're actually changing this narrative and showing there are Jewish refugees as well, which people don't think there is. We also then, usually around Apartheid Week, we have Apartheid Week Exposed, which is combating the misinformation that students are facing during Israeli Apartheid Week on their campus. So from certain issues, explaining what genocide is, explaining wider, this rhetoric that Israelis are stealing Palestinian land or water. We have a whole bunch of materials about this and combating that. And our last one is This Is Zionism campaign, which is a campaign which is about basically explaining what Zionism is, where it comes from religious, social, political aspects, political Zionism, and combating this narrative that Israel is a colonial entity. So we work in many ways with students, and it varies day to day what the student requires, as you can imagine.
Absolutely. So, Christina, share with us and maybe give a message to any Christian students watching this program, because this is an important one, that they have essentially a historic opportunity to stand with their fellow Jewish students and do what you did and what I've done, and that's kind of pioneer into the kind of Jewish world, and to show love and solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people.
All I would say is I would encourage you, if you have a love for Israel and really take firm in what God is saying in His Bible and completely believe it is 100% truth and accuracy and authentic, you will support, and you should naturally support Israel. And to do that as a student is a big thing. I won't say it's going to be easy. It definitely takes a lot of courage to do that, but I would really encourage you, and I've consistently seen blessing after blessing after blessing in my life since I've stepped up for Israel. It hasn't come without issues, that's for sure, because it is a very, as you can imagine, Simon, you'll know and confirm, it's a very spiritual battle. But my most recent blessing is meeting my fiance, who has a heart for Israel as well, and I never believed I would find a partner who would, support Israel the way I do. So I encourage, your blessings can come in many ways. I'm just giving one example for myself, but I would really encourage Christian students to really stand with their Jewish brothers and sisters, and take a stand for Israel.
And finally, within 30 seconds, Christina, share with us how important it is to engage in the media, to look at news reports, whether they are broadcast news reports, whether they're articles about Israel, and support the work of CAMERAUK to provide media accuracy, which is so important because truth really does matter.
All I do is encourage you, when you're looking at media sources, to think of where the funding's coming from. Is there a bias already inherently from the outlet? Where's the journalist, their background? Where are they getting their information from? Think about it critically, but when it comes to CAMERAUK, there's many ways you can support us. You can support us by helping give tips. You can support us financially, or you can even just share the word and what we're doing in our articles as well.
Excellent. Christina, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report today. Thank you. And I want to thank you for watching this program home. There's a huge battle that Israel faces, not only on the battlefront in Gaza against Hamas, but also in the media with awful biased news reports against Israel, which demonize Israel, it makes it harder for Israel to have that moral reserve. And of course, we've also discussed the massive problem on our university campuses. As Christians, we can't afford to be silent during this time. It's time to speak up for Israel and the Jewish people and to pray for them. And I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.